I'm the Assistant Director for Student Involvement in the Office of Student Involvement Activities. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. So for our final Spring 2020 RSO Advisor Workshop, we're going to talk about a topic we get a lot of questions about, which has to do with organizational finances. I'm going to lay some groundwork and fundamentals as it relates to topics that apply to our student organizations and their finances. And then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and some things we do and don't recommend as an advisor to our student organizations. So some fundamental ideas we want to make sure that you understand about student organizations. The first has to do with something called an EIN, which is an employer identification number, sometimes known as a tax ID. So the way I usually explain this to our student org leaders is that it's like a Social Security number, but for an organization. They're issued by the IRS. You have to apply to the IRS to get one. And it is how the IRS understands your organization. I'll talk a minute about what you're going to need that for. Also, I wanted to remind you all that in the definition for a student organization, an RSO, that UNLV RSOs are considered separate entities from the institution. They're not extensions of UNLV, which means that they don't have access to the university's EIN or tax ID number or tax exempt status. So that's really important to remember. So we can't just provide UNLV's EIN number to our student organizations whenever they need one. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the way that UNLV student organizations account for their money. So there are two ways right now. It's with UNLV accounts. So that would be perhaps a department or academic unit that has access to maybe a PG number or some other account in Workday that's dedicated to that student organization. I'll use one in our office, for example, Rebel Events Board. Our office fully supports that organization, and the funding for that organization comes from our department's budget. And that means that all of the purchases that are made for that organization come out of a UNLV account. The number of our student organizations who have access to that is very low, so the likelihood is that that's not the case for your organization, although there are a few. Most of our student organizations do their banking with a non-UNLV account, often sometimes known as an off-campus account. That would be someone like US Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, any off-campus bank. So make sure when you're thinking about your finances, whether we're talking in terms of a UNLV account or a non-UNLV account. When it comes to UNLV accounts, in order to even open an account, a student organization is going to need that EIN or tax ID number. An off-campus bank isn't going to open an organizational account without that. And we don't want to encourage our student orgs to open accounts with personal information, their social security number, and then that would be a personal account. This needs to be an organizational account. Sometimes to open that account, most banks are going to require that they have some establishing documentation. Each bank might define that differently, but that's often, articles of creation or meeting minutes, or maybe a letter from their advisor or from our office, which we can provide. Also, you're going to have to decide who has access to the money in that account, your account signers. Those should be students. And there should be at least one, there should be more than one student who has access to the funds. So whoever's going to be the account signer needs to go in person with their ID to the bank in order to create those accounts. And then most banks have some sort of opening deposit requirement. Every bank is going to be different. It might be as low as like $100, but it depends on the bank. Actually, I'm going to go back one. I just want to touch on one more. When we talk about needing more than one student on the account, I want to explain why. So a lot of our students, that's kind of for two reasons. One, it's to create accountability, which we'll talk about a little later. It helps make sure that students know that there's more than just them looking at their finances and getting to make choices about how funds are spent. But also, it's the nature of student organizations. Sometimes a student, is really overwhelmed with classes or has a lot going on in their personal life, and they just might not be as in communication with the organization as the org needs at a time when they may need to do their spending. So it's time to register for their conference. They want to go ahead and submit that payment online, but the person who has access to their bank account and their debit card isn't answering their text messages because they're just overwhelmed with studying for finals or something like that. So that's when it's really helpful to make sure that more than one student has access to those accounts. So the follow-up that we get from a lot of advisors is, should I be an account signer on my student orgs account? The Student Involvement Activities Team does not recommend that be the case. I personally am an advisor to a few student organizations, and I choose not to have direct access to their funds in a non-UNLV account. And the reason for that, and the reason we advise you not to do the same, is that non-UNLV accounts are not NSHE accounts. They don't have any oversight from NSHE or UNLV, and they're not bound by the financial policies of NSHE. It also means that there's no protection to you as an advisor from NSHE or UNLV as it relates to what happens with the funds in those accounts. So with that in mind, you can still help your student orgs be good financial stewards and understand how to make positive choices for the organization without directly having access to their funds. So some funding sources, we get that question a lot from students who are particularly work new student orgs. Well, how do we get funding for our organization? There's lots of ways. Obviously, dues is the most common. It depends on the organization. Some orgs don't charge dues, but some do. Some might be part of a national organization where they're required to pay some money to the national organization and then may also charge additional funds for the individual chapter. But some of our smaller organizations that only exist at UNLV also charge dues. Sometimes they cover things, T-shirts, or a small amount of money to go towards events, whatever it is. If you're charging dues, it should just be clear to students who are joining the organization what those dues cover and what they get for that money and how frequently dues are charged. CSUN, so the Undergraduate Student Government, CSUN, offers some funding to student organizations through the Ways and Means Committee. We'll talk about that in much more detail a little bit later. GPSA, the Graduate Professional Student Association, also provides some funding to graduate student organizations. UNLV department sponsorships. So a sponsorship doesn't have to look like you think about, where a department hands them a check for money. A UNLV department sponsorship can look like a department purchasing things on an org's behalf. So they might get a department to cover the cost of their T-shirts or the food at an event or the marketing for an organization. Or maybe instead of things that have a financial component, it could come from volunteers to work their events, or outreach or publicity, or emails sent on that organization's behalf. So they also can get funding from community organizations. So there might be a local business or service-related organization in the Vegas Valley that they have a relationship that provides some sponsorship. Again, that could be through financial means, but also through donations, in-kind donations, or free space or something like that. Rebel Raiser is a great platform. So our student organizations have access to this through the foundation. Rebel Raiser is our crowdfunding platform run by the foundation. It's similar to GoFundMe, but it's run through the institution, which means that there are some definite benefits to the organization in utilizing it. And then a lot of organizations will also just do on or off-campus fundraisers. These are your more traditional things like a bake sale or a car wash. And we'll talk about some fundraising opportunities later on. So some fundraising dues. We tell student organizations really want to make sure you're engaging all the members of the organization in brainstorming. Particularly when it comes to fundraising, we encourage student orgs to think about what matters to this student organization and how can we make that a fundraising opportunity. So for example, if you have an organization that is related to theater productions, a good fundraiser could have to do with a fashion show or some sort of opportunity to make costumes or something like that, where for another organization that might not be a fundraiser that makes sense for them. So think about how they get creative and brainstorm from lots of people in the organization. We want to make sure that they're following UNLV policies, particularly if they're doing an on-campus fundraiser. If it's on campus, they can reach out to Student Union Event Services or check their website. They can give some guidance on UNLV policies. We want to encourage them to send fundraising targets that are aspirational but attainable. So that's great if they have a goal of fundraising $20,000, but if they only fundraised $1,000 last year, that might be too aspirational. So figuring out where the balance of that, but we want to make sure it's something that they can push themselves to reach. encouraging them to plan ahead. That's really important. Fundraisers can fall apart when they look like they're mismanaged and poorly planned, and a potential donor doesn't want to give money when they aren't sure that the organization can handle using it well. So planning ahead can be really important. We also want to establish what are they going to do with that money and how will it be managed once they raise it. So again, a donor wants to know what their money is going to go towards. So being able to articulate that and understand how it's going to be managed after they receive it is helpful. And then my kind of best advice I can give to student orgs is to try to keep it simple with their fundraising. Sometimes when they come up with overly complex ideas, that idea can be so expensive to pull off that then they're not getting to keep any of the funds that they're bringing in. So sometimes overly complicating it can then kind of bite them in the butt a little bit. So some fundraising don't plan last minute. Last minute fundraisers don't typically go well. We also want to remind them that, again, because they're separate entities from the institution, they don't have access to the UNLV logo or trademark. For example, the ARC on my polo here, that is a registered trademark of the institution. UNLV RSOs are not supposed to be using that. Now, there is on our website a UNLV RSO logo that they can use, but it's not the traditional branded items that they're used to seeing from the institution. We also don't want them to be vague with donors about what money is going to be used for. So if they just say, well, it's going to go to support our organization, a donor wants to know in what way. So a better explanation might be, we're going to use these funds to put on a fashion show, or we're going to use these funds to travel to a competition or conference. But just saying like we're going to use these funds in a general capacity doesn't typically spark donors to want to give the same way that a specific use would. And then never promise more than they can deliver when it comes to their fundraising opportunities. So I want to talk to you about the CSUN Ways and Means Committee. They review and oversee all of CSUN's finances, and they provide RSOs with supplemental funding. So I typically use the word supplemental instead of supportive. They don't provide full support for student organizations because they only have about $300,000 a year, and there's 400 student organizations on campus. That's not enough to really fully support every organization, but they can supplement funding and provide funding beyond what any individual student organization may be able to raise on their own. They also enhance student activities and campus life at UNLV. So is your organization eligible for Ways and Means funding? They need to be in good standing with UNLV and have at least 5 undergraduate members. The application has to be submitted by an undergraduate student. They need to be a registered supplier with NSHE and have an EIN number, which we talked about earlier. The registered supplier process can be somewhat confusing, so if your students are confused by that, feel free to have them reach out and we'll help them through that. And then they obviously need to follow all the guidelines and steps that are outlined in the Ways and Means operating policy. So if they're going to apply, that's where I usually tell them they should really start is with the Ways and Means operating policy. If you go on the Ways and Means website, which is down at the bottom, unlv.edu/CSUN, and you look at the operating policy and the frequently asked questions, I would say 90% of their questions are probably going to be answered there. Anything beyond that is probably very specific to their organization. But that website is very robust. And that will really tell them what's typically funded, how they submit their funding application, what the process looks like, what the necessary requirements are. This year, this summer, the start of FY21, we're going to change the application process. It used to be through a Google form, but now they're going to submit their application directly through the Involvement Center. They'll attach a budget, and on the CSUN website is a template that they need to follow. And in addition to a budget, they need to attach any quotes for things that they're going to be purchasing in that budget. And then once that's received and reviewed by the Ways and Means Committee, they'll put them on an agenda to present at a Ways and Means Committee meeting, and then again at a full Senate meeting before that funding can be approved. We also want to mention that Ways and Means offers new organization startup fund. So this is for any org that was started within the past year. that hasn't existed on campus or hasn't existed on campus for the last 3 years. So the benefit of this is that it is easier to apply. They can get up to $750 in available funding. So the idea of this is that they're really here to support some startup costs, typically marketing. They might need some flyers printed or a tablecloth made for them, those sorts of things, some promotional items. But these are things, instead of having to go through the full registered supplier process, maybe they don't have a bank account or an EIN number yet. This is a way that CSUN can spend for a handful of things on their behalf without them having to directly issue money to them. So that's a great way for new orgs to get a little bit of funding. If they want any more than what's included in the new org startup fund, they can always submit a Ways and Means funding request like any other student organization. And so moving away from CSUN, I want to just talk about the idea of financial transparency. This is something you can really help your student org leaders with. Members in the org need to know how much money the organization has, how healthy their financial outlook is, what they use that money for, how it's being spent. A member in the organization, particularly if they're paying dues, should never be wondering what the money gets used for. That should be very transparent with them. A great way to do this is through treasurer's reports. So it can look different for every organization. This can be, an update in every e-board meeting. It can be done through email or posts on their involvement center page. But treasurer's reports include things like account balances, recent spending, projected income, what they're going to spend that money on between now and the next report, or now and the rest of the year. We encourage them to take votes from the organization in terms of when they make large spending purchases. So say there's a piece of equipment that's pretty expensive for the organization to buy before an individual goes out and purchases it for the organization. They really want to make sure everyone's on board with that large purchase. And then if that organization has a constitution or bylaws, really making sure that they're following those governing documents when appropriate, when they outline how spending occurs in the organization, is really important for them. We also want you to help them with some financial accountability measures. So you should, we encourage you to have regular financial check-ins with student leaders. Now, beyond that, what that looks like, we really encourage you to figure out with your student org leaders. So that could be a once a semester check-in. It could be a weekly check-in. It could be some sort of report that they send to you. It can look however you want, but it's just the idea that you're regularly checking in with them. How much money do you have? What are you using it for? Are you making smart choices? How are you budgeting your money? How are you accounting for it? Those sorts of things. We encourage them to keep digital copies of all of their receipts in a shared space. So typically a Google Drive folder is a really great place for these, so that anyone who needs access or wants to see how much was spent because they have questions about where their money is going is a really great thing. Also, that can be really helpful when it comes to their Ways and Means funding. If they get money from CSUN, they then later have to provide receipts to show that it was spent in the approved way. So keeping it in a shared drive on Google is a great way to do that. They want all e-board members and an advisor should have access to their financial records. So maybe that's, providing the monthly banking statement in a PDF form. That could be a great way to do that. And then again, we talked about having more than one student who have access to the accounts. And we want to just make sure you help them create some checks and balances procedures so that smart choices are made about their money. That's really kind of what all of it goes back to from you as an advisor perspective, is how do you help your organization make quality choices about their income, their spending, how they're tracking that, how they're being transparent, and how they're being accountable to each other. And then making sure that there's a good transition of records between e-boards. And then I want to touch on philanthropy efforts. So We define philanthropy as donating money, goods, or services with a defined objective to an outside organization. So that's not fundraising to their individual organization. That might be that they want to fundraise to give money to St. Jude's or Opportunity Village or another organization, nonprofit organization. It helps build community at UNLV and in the Vegas Valley. But when you're talking about philanthropy, 100% of the funds that you raise need to go to that outside organization. If you're saying that you're raising money for that organization, all the money needs to go to them so that donors understand what's being done with the money that they're giving. Any costs that are incurred to hold that philanthropy should come from the student organization and not the money that's going to the philanthropy, that the philanthropy money is going to. University funds cannot be donated to outside organizations. So that's not a way that departments can support an organization. A university department can't just write a check to that or outside organization. And then depending on your organization, additional policies may apply to fraternity and sorority life chapters. So check the FSL website. And check with their UNLV staff advisor to make sure that they're following those guidelines. Okay, budget. So this is another great way that advisors can really help our student org leaders. So budgets matter because it helps provide the student organization with a planning tool on how they control their funds. It helps them set financial goals. It helps create historical records. And it provides a working document to maintain financial transparency. It also helps them make those attainable but realistic goals. And assist them in making data-based decisions. So helping them create their budgets is something you can do. Help encourage them to start planning early, outline all of their planned events and activities for the year in that budget. So they can have, it might be good to have a budget with one tab that's like an overall budget for the year that says, for example, for this event, it's going to be $6,000. And then another tab that says how that the $6,000 for that event is going to be itemized out would be good. But how it's structured can kind of be up to you and the organization. But it should cover everything that's going to happen for the year. They need to research and explore multiple funding sources. So not just thinking they're going to get their money from CSUN, but how are they fundraising? How are they bringing in dues? Whatever their income sources are. They need to define their needed expenses. So things like cost of marketing, if they have dues to a national organization, if they know that equipment is kind of broken and needs to be replaced in the year. They should get quotes for everything before they make any purchases from multiple sources to make sure they're making the best choices with their funds. And helping them rank what they need versus what they want. These are the things we absolutely have to purchase this year, and these are the things we would like to get if we have the money. Those should be at the bottom of the list, and helping them develop that list can be a place for you as an advisor. We want to make sure they're reviewing, revising, and cross-referencing that budget, particularly as it relates back to their off-campus account. So if their budget and their account ledger don't match, what matters is actually what's in their account, and they need to figure out how they're not, why their budget doesn't match. The budget should be shared with members and voted on so that everyone has buy-in to the way that budget was built. And it helps create a historical record so that can be handed down from e-board to e-board. So ways that you can provide some financial oversight. You can advise students in making smart choices. I've talked about that a little bit. It's all about helping them make the best choices for the organization and how they spend and purchase. Helping them monitor their budgets regularly, helping them maintain minimum balances in their account for rainy day funds, continuing to refine their processes and procedures and help them understand what's working and what isn't and how they can be more productive. Encouraging them to be timely in the way they update their budget so that they don't overspend, particularly if they're working on an event and multiple people are spending for that event. It can get confusing if all of a sudden they've overspent because they weren't updating their budget and people thought there was more money to spend than they actually had. Make sure that they're abiding by whatever accountability measures that they've set in place and that you can help them control their costs. So to kind of wrap things up, particularly as it relates to what is your role as an advisor. You can help provide a lot of strong direction and oversight to a student organization without having to directly manage their money. Again, coming back to the idea that we don't recommend that you're directly managing or having access to funds, but you're helping them make good choices about the money they do have. You can help them understand that decision making for non-personal finances, it's very different than their personal money. So for a lot of our students, managing their own personal finances is a new skill that they're developing. And it's not the same thing as managing money for an organization. How they make decisions is going to be different. How they get buy-in from others. Typically with your personal finances, you're the only one that it may be affecting. But with an organization's finances, there's a lot more to consider. So making sure they understand those differences. And this is a big thing for me. Sometimes it's okay to let students learn through failure, but it's up to you to know when that's okay and when it's not. So I look at the risk for failure. When I'm talking to my student org leaders, I say, and I don't necessarily think they're making the best choice, or I think they're being frivolous with their money. I ask, well, how bad would it be if they failed at this? Or if they didn't make a smart choice. And if the consequences aren't that bad, sometimes I will let them learn through that failure. But if it's, a signature event, or I know there's going to be a lot of upper administration there, or I know particularly it's a philanthropy event and it would be bad for our partnership with the nonprofit we're working with, those are the times I might step in a little more and really push them a little more to make sure they don't end up in a failure. So figuring out what that looks like for you as an advisor is really important. So just you're going to have to figure out what feels right in that area. Okay, so that's the last of my content. Here's just some contact information for me. The only downside of doing this as a pre-recorded webinar is that I don't have the opportunity to interact with you and answer your questions. This is an area we get the most questions about, as I mentioned. So I really want to encourage you, if you made it all the way to the end of this video, I will want to encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions. If there's something I didn't cover, if there's still things you're confused about, if there's a situation that's very specific to your organization, whatever the case may be, send me an email, marnie.dow@unlv.edu, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I'm able and try to help you help your students. So thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope that everyone's staying safe and healthy, and we can't wait to see you all back on campus. Have a good one.